So I've been in the crypto space about 20 years or so. My background is hardware and security modules, and key management, and PKI, and mobile payments, and code signing, and various other exciting stuff. My company, Whitewood, we're a startup. We're in Boston, and we're actually a technology spin out from Los Alamos National Labs, and we're focused on quantum cryptography and quantum entropy and quantum random number generators. But I'm here not to talk about that stuff particularly, but I'll certainly be able to talk about it afterwards. Alrighty. So I put this chart up not because I'm trying to rub salt into the wounds. You know, there's obviously lots of data breaches out there, and chances are there's going to be more and more. I put it up because it's a cool tool. I don't know if any of you have seen this before. So it's informationisbeautiful.net, and it's an interactive chart. You click on any of these bubbles and it tells you who was affected, what data was lost, what the attack vector was, and you can sort it by industry and by geography and by attack vector. So it's a pretty neat tool. And it shows, of course, over the last 10, 12 years or so, of course, that the circles are getting more numerous and the circles are getting bigger. The size of the circle is the number of records that were lost as part of the breach. So it's pretty cool. It's the most interesting sort of breach summary tool I've ever come across. So of course the reason why the number of breaches is increasing, and it's probably going to continue to increase, really comes down to these three things. You're intimately familiar with the issues. The data we transfer is getting more and more value. There's more and more reason for an attacker to try and steal stuff. There's more things to steal it from. These days we think about it. More lines of code, more transactions, more users, again, more endpoints. Pete Lindstrom this morning from IDC was talking about the issue of digital trust and creating digital trust and talking about deperimeterization. You know, when you start looking at this sort of stuff, you can see clearly the notion of traditional perimeters and stuff doesn't apply. Those of you may remember the Jericho Forum 15 years or so ago, raising this issue of deperimeterization. So digital trust, and Pete mentioned it, ultimately gets reinforced by cryptography. It's hard to think about how you could secure the IoT, how you could secure data migration to the cloud without cryptography. In fact, I think it's probably impossible. If anybody has any other brilliant mechanisms of protecting data while it's moving over a wire or while it's stored at rest, other than encryption, then I'd love to hear it. You should probably be, down the patent office right now patenting it. So when we talk about cryptography, we're talking about three real aspects. We're talking about encryption, obviously, for confidentiality. We're talking about digital certificates for authenticating people or for authenticating software, processes, devices, whatever it might be. And then digital signatures for vouching for the integrity of data. So you think about an IoT device, gathering information that's probably got some sensitivity associated with it, so transferring that data back to the mothership. We mentioned drones earlier, drones taking video of some sensitive site. That video feed's got to be encrypted coming back, but you also want to believe that the device that's sending you the video is your device and not somebody else's device, and you want to believe that the information being sent back is not just confidential, but has a high level of integrity. And you can use digital signatures, public key infrastructure, for those of you who have played with certificates and PKI, to sign documents and sign messages. I mean, it would be impossible to think, mobile payments, for example, Samsung Pay or Apple Pay, the amount of authentication, data integrity, and data confidentiality as that click on your phone works its way all the way back to the payment system, all the way back to your issuing bank. All of that brings into play essentially every aspect of cryptography. So different applications put a different emphasis on one of these three legs of the stool, if you like, but all of them become critical. People tend to think of encryption when we think about cryptography, but certainly authentication and signatures become equally important. So when we think about cryptography, we sort of immediately gravitate towards the algorithms, triple DES and AES and elliptic curve and all this stuff. It rapidly becomes sort of alphabet soup in terms of figuring out what algorithms we're talking about. So I'm not going to talk about algorithms particularly today. The algorithms don't get broken. The reality is we're pretty good at inventing algorithms and proving the integrity and security of algorithms and then building those algorithms into products. I mean, there have been implementation issues over the years. But we have a pretty good certification scheme. We have a certification scheme run by NIST called FIPS 140, which if you're in the payment sector, is basically a mandatory certification scheme. It certainly is in the government. A lot of products are FIPS 140 certified, and that basically proves that the implementations are valid of the algorithms. And it's pretty easy to prove an algorithm's been implemented correctly because you put a set of numbers in and you can look at the numbers that come out and you can prove that they're the right numbers. It's simply an algorithmic process. But what I think is most interesting about cryptography, ultimately is about the secrets. What makes crypto different than pretty much any other security technology is the fact that it relies on secrets. And unlike most of the security technologies, it's sort of black or white. It's either there or it's not there. If somebody gets their hands on the key, then the crypto's done. Encryption can be broken, identity can be faked, and integrity of data can be forged. So if somebody can change a document, re-sign it using some broken key, and bingo, they can prove the integrity of something that no longer has integrity. So whereas intrusion detection or anti-malware or any of these other tools, there's shades of grey. They might see a signature, they might not. They might be patched, they might not. Crypto's sort of either there or it's not. The data's essentially safe or it's not safe. But pretty much all of that comes down to the secrecy of these keys. The other aspect, of course, of cryptography is you get to break previous data and you get to break future data. So there's a forwards and backwards issue in time that cryptography has from a vulnerability point of view that most of the systems don't. When we think about attacks against keys, we're really thinking about really two near-term issues and one longer-term issue. So there is the issue of people stealing keys. These are just secrets. You can steal them just like any other chunks of data, or you can guess them. Keys are just at the end of the day, fancy passwords, and you can guess a key as an alternative to stealing a key. Every day, in principle, we spend billions and billions of dollars as a security industry protecting stuff from being stolen. So you'd like to think we get better as time goes by at protecting keys from being stolen. But unfortunately, almost by definition, guessing keys and brute force attacks on keys gets easier for the attacker every day because the attacker gets a better and better computer every day. And these days, of course, the attacker can go rent 10,000 instances in Amazon and do an awful lot more cracking than they were able to do 10 years ago when they'd have to go and physically buy the servers themselves and set them up in their own basement. So the top one sort of gets better for us every day. The second one sort of gets worse for us every day. And then when quantum computing shows up, and I'll talk about the threat of quantum computers at the end, that's when basically it becomes a game changer, and we have the threat of a disruptive force in the crypto industry as a whole. So looking at the first issue, key theft, whether it's or key loss, whether it's accidental or whether it's an insider threat, this is a pretty mature industry. So when we think about key theft, we tend to think about anti-tamper devices. We tend to think about physical protection for keys and physical key stores. So all of this stuff's been around for at least a decade or two. I'm sure some of you have deployed hardware security modules. They've been around forever. Some industries, they're actually mandated. Payments industry, if you're doing credit card processing, you're doing key management for ATMs or point of sale devices, then you're going to have one or some of these in your basement. Of course, the reason why we all want to carry around chip cards these days is because they have hardware anti-tamper protection for the keys stored on the card, rather than relying on keys to be stored in a mag stripe. USB sticks, again, tamper resistant, passcode protected USB sticks, and then TPM chips. Again, Pete Lindstrom this morning reminded us all about some of the work that Microsoft did 15 years ago to try to build hardware roots of trust in laptops. TPM chips, they didn't really get much use until the last few years. These days, Windows is a heavy user of TPM chips. But again, been around a long time and all about creating a physically secure, tamper-resistant place to store these keys so that they stay secret. So I'm not going to talk about, there's weeks of presentations just behind any one of these technologies, but it's a pretty well understood space and there are pretty well established vendors in that space, and there are certification schemes for all these products. When we think about guessing keys, so the attack vector 2, if you like, this is all about whether keys are truly random. In principle, the whole philosophy of cryptography is that there are so many combinations of these keys. If we have a key that's 128 bits long, we have 2 to the power 128 number of combinations, which is a ridiculously large number. I mean, you're getting into the sort of the realms of the number of atoms in the universe type number. This is not a big number, this is a gargantuan number. So the assumption is that finding any 2 keys that are the same should be effectively impossible. And the theory is that an attacker with an unlimited access to computing power, it's still practically impossible. It's infeasible that they might stage a brute force attack to go find a key. So that philosophy is fine, and unless it turns out that some of these keys aren't particularly random. Now, they don't have to be completely predictable, they just have to be slightly less than perfectly random to start diminishing the pain of an attacker dramatically in terms of getting hold of keys. There was a survey last year, University of Pennsylvania did a survey of all of the public-facing SSL websites on the planet, hundreds of thousands, and they found that nearly 1% of the keys on the planet were exactly the same. Finding 2 keys on the planet that are the same should in theory be impossible, never mind 1% being actually the same, and another 2% were easily crackable. We'll get into the reasons why in a minute. So of course they can be random because things are not working right, or they can be non-random because somebody doesn't want them to be particularly random, and that starts to get into the thorny topic of weakened random number generators and backdoors, of which there's been various news. Over the decades there have been dozens of examples of operating systems with implementation flaws where it turns out that they've been generating essentially the same number across every computer. Just over the early this year, Siemens did a patch of all of their building controllers, IoT devices, because it turned out they're all generating the same SSL keys. Yes, sir.
Von Neumann said that those who attempt to arrive at random numbers by arithmetic means
is living in a state of sin. That's right. You've seen my next 2 slides. That's right. We'll see that in a minute, don't worry. And it was a long time ago.
The early 60s, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, the 50s, yeah. So, lots of examples. Those of you might remember a couple of years ago, NIST rather embarrassingly had to withdraw one of their standards for random number generators because it turned out that it was weaker than expected, and of course many rumours and suggestions that it had been purposefully weakened for the purposes of finding keys. So SANS Institute earlier this year at the RSA show actually said that weak random number generators was one of their top 7 threats for this year. And the reason why they say that is because a weak random number generator is effectively the perfect attack. If I'm the guy that knows how you're generating your keys, then I'm the only person that can find your keys. And you would never know that I'm doing it, and nor would anybody else. And as long as I keep my mouth shut, I can keep on doing it forever. So it becomes the perfect attack. People call it kleptography. So why is this such a pain? And you gentlemen alluded to it earlier. Because most of random numbers, which we make our keys from, so the application's making keys, and the application gets its random numbers from the operating system. The trouble is, the operating system is just a piece of software, and asking a piece of software to do something random is not what it's there for, right? When a piece of software does something random, we call it a bug. We don't call it a feature. And as you correctly point out, von Neumann said exactly that. If you think a piece of software or any algorithmic process can do something random, then you're probably kidding yourself. And he thought this a long time ago, 1951. Because the reality is, if you need to do something random, then randomness can only come from the physical world. There's a reason why when we draw lotteries, we have balls jangling around in cages. We don't have people pushing red buttons on computers and putting up images on screens. We like to see it physical. We like to see that there's some natural process, some actual entropy, they call it, which is the measure of uncertainty. And that can only come from the real world. Only trouble is, our applications don't really live in the real world. They sort of used to. They sort of used to live on servers in our basement, but they don't. They live in virtualized environments. They live in containers. They even live in serverless places these days, and they live in clouds, and they live in IoT devices where there's not much entropy, there's not much randomness. There's not many keyboards. There's not many users. If you're running a cloud, then your job is to try and make the stuff in that cloud as uniform and as predictable as possible, because you want to be able to put people's workloads anywhere in that cloud and to move them around to best fit your needs for capacity. So the last thing you want is weird and crazy, physical real world stuff happening in that environment. So we have this interesting dilemma that our applications are doing more and more cryptography, with GDPR and data breach disclosure laws, encryption of data at rest and encryption data at use, PCI DSS, in the payment card industry essentially mandates the use of encryption. So our applications are doing more and more crypto. The keys for doing that crypto are getting longer and longer and longer, but unfortunately our applications are increasingly hosted in places where there's not much entropy. Not just VMs, but IoT devices as well. IoT devices are low power, low memory, low horsepower, low everything, low cost devices, and they don't have a lot of luxury for going sampling the real world to go find bits of entropy. I put this slide in as a bit of a joke. So this is Cloudflare's reception. Cloudflare is a cloud hosting provider. And they actually do this. They actually have 100 lava lamps on a wall and a video camera pointing at them, and they use this to generate entropy. I'm not taking the mickey. It's true, and it's not that they're deluding themselves. They know exactly what they're doing, and it is a useful tool, but it's more marketing gimmick, I think, than anything else. But it makes the point. They have 3 data centers and 3 different mechanical methods of generating entropy within each data center. This is the one, I think, in California with lava lamps. And of course, there are horror stories of people actually using lava lamps themselves in their own data centers to generate entropy, to generate randomness, which is great until the cleaners turn off the lamp at night. And everything sort of goes quiet. Anyway, so how's this stuff work? So some of you have probably heard this phrase, pseudo random number generator, PRNG. So that's what lives inside operating systems, and that's the best you can get with software. Okay, so software cranks through an algorithmic process to generate tons and tons of random numbers using these things called PRNGs, which would be entirely predictable were it not for the fact we had entropy sources and we were seeding those processes with a few bits of randomness. Okay, the reason why it's a dotted line versus a thick line is we have a few bits of seed material generating potentially gigabytes of random numbers. Okay. The analogy I use, it's like the difference between dealing a deck of cards and shuffling a deck of cards. Okay. If I had some large deck of cards in order, I just bought it off the shelf, and I was dealing around this room, you'd have a pretty decent guess at what card you were going to guess. You're going to be dealt. And that's the mechanistic process of a PRNG inside of an operating system. Shuffling the deck is the process of, how do I randomize this up? And the more I care about shuffling the deck, and the rate with which I shuffle the deck dramatically improves the quality of the deal. Think about a pseudo-random number generator. Another analogy perhaps is like an audio amplifier. Okay, so in a PRNG can't add randomness. It takes the randomness from a small number of bits and amplifies it to a large number of bits, like an audio amplifier. Right? An audio amplifier takes a small signal from a microphone and blows it out into a public address system, but it doesn't add any musicality. It makes the song louder, but it doesn't make the song any better. Same argument with randomness in PRNGs. Plenty of standards for these things, and one of the standards for these PRNGs is the standard that NIST had to deprecate because it turned out it was weak. Easy to test because they're just algorithms. You can put a seed in, you can look at the numbers that come out the back end, they're entirely deterministic, so you can test the implementation of a PRNG easily, and there are dozens of them out there. So then the question is, well, where do these seeds come from? How good are they? How do you tell? So in a computer, you have our PRNG sitting in the operating system, and it's trying to gather entropy from the real world as best it can. Jitter, timing in the CPU, hard drive activity, interrupts coming from how long it takes a hard drive to find a piece of data on a track. It's not totally random, but it's better than predictable. Keyboard activity, people typing on a keyboard, mouse clicks, cameras, microphones. You can point antennas in the sky and pick up cosmic radiation or radio waves, and goodness knows what. People over the years, 20 or 30 years, have found a crazy number of ways of trying to scalp entropy from the world around your computer or their server. You know, and that's fine. And the nice thing about entropy is it's always additive, right? So even if I had really good entropy and I added some really crappy entropy to it, it's still better than good entropy. It still gets somewhat better. You don't dilute entropy. So just in theory, the more sources you got, the better. Crash it all together, everything's fine. Problem is, in a virtualized environment, you don't have any users, you don't have any keyboards, you don't have any mice, you don't have any hard drives. All your VMs sit on the same physical hardware, so they all see the same network activity and they all see the same CPU jitter. And worse still, when you replicate your VM images, you take your snapshot and you create 100 copies of it, which is what we do all the time. Of course, you're snapshotting the state of the PRNG, so you're now creating 100 synchronized random number generators that then need to be reshuffled, but unfortunately, they don't get much entropy, and if they do get entropy, they're all seeing the same entropy because they're on the same device. So, a worrying situation. So if you're worried about an individual particular VM, think about the entire application environment in an organization. It's meant to be a fussy picture, don't worry about it too much. You think about the devices, you think about where the applications run. You know, when you start introducing IoT into this mix, if you're the poor security person that has to look at this landscape, the reality is you may have specified, you know, gee, we should be using AES-256. You may have some policies around where that crypto comes from and how it's organized, but the reality is you don't know very much, and probably don't have very much control either, about where that stuff actually runs on at any given point in time. So knowing that your keys have got 256 bits is interesting, but it would be more interesting to know it had 256 bits of actual entropy, and that you actually had 2 to the 256 combinations of potential key. So the reality is, most folks have a reasonable amount of control of how the crypto's done. They have almost no evidence and quality of how good the keys actually are. And one of the big problems of all this is you can't test to make sure it's okay, because you can't easily prove randomness. Because proving randomness, because if you could prove randomness, right, you'd just make a whole bunch of keys, you'd find the random ones and throw all the crappy ones away.
Just scan all the SSL.
That would be great.
But you can prove non-randomness.
You can prove non-randomness, yes, because trying to prove randomness, you're trying to prove a negative. You're trying to prove the absence of a pattern or a bias or a correlation or something. So trying to, you know, this is the atheist's dilemma. You can't prove the absence of anything, right? So proving the absence of anything in a bunch of data, if I gave you each a gigabit of so-called random data, and I said, okay, you can apply any resource to this, you know, and I'll give you 10 years to go and find any pattern or any bias, anything dirty going on inside this data, you know, at what point would you declare it to be truly random? It's the same problem you have in proving crypto algorithms. You know, you beat on them for 10 years, and if nobody's broken it, you sort of generally say, okay, it seems to be okay, because you're trying to prove something can't be broken. Same problem. So proving randomness is not something you can do afterwards. If your keys stop being random, then there's no alarms go off. You know, back to this being the perfect data theft vehicle, essentially. So you have to sort of plan randomness into the system. You have to architect it into the way you build stuff. You can't be reactive. Good news is there are some safety measures. So anybody familiar with dev random and dev random? People play with Linux? Yeah, there's always a few hands go up. So in Linux, there's 2 PRNGs, dev random and dev random. Difference between the two is one of them has a safety measure. So dev random will only give you, if you ask it for a random number, it will only give you a random number if it thinks it's got enough randomness that it's captured from the keyboard or wherever. Dev random will always give you a random number, even if Linux says I got no randomness. That's a safety measure. So if you're a developer, some of you may be developers, which one of these are you going to use? You know, are you going to sit there waiting to terminate your SSL connection request until your systems manage to find some entropy? Yeah, probably not. So yeah, most developers use dev random. And if you look online, you'll find thousands of blog postings where developers essentially try and convince themselves that that's okay, to a greater or lesser degree of success. So the way around this is people try and find ways of supplementing the local supplies of entropy into these PRNGs. Nothing wrong with PRNGs providing their CD code with supplementary sources, and I couldn't resist putting my lava lamp up. So there's sort of three ways that people supplement entropy. The first is sort of software daemons. So these are software tools that are built that run on the same computer that try to do a better job than the operating system of scalping entropy from the local system, doing a better job at capturing jitter timing, interrupt timing, traffic loads, whatever. And in the same way there have been dozens of ways in which operating systems have evolved to find entropy. It's been open season for the last 30 years for folks to find interesting, cute little personal favorite tools for generating entropy. I couldn't resist listing the one for lava lamps. You can go and check it out yourself if you like, and buy yourself a lava lamp and give it a go. Havaged is probably the most famous. People pronounce it in lots of different ways. But Havaged tries to find entropy in the way that the CPU processes commands, which is great, and it exists. The good news is this is all open source. The bad news is this is all open source. So, if you want to keep ahead of all this stuff and track it and, keep it, figure it all out and make it part of your, DevOps and all the rest of it, this is fine. And lots of people do. And like I say, Havaged is a very popular tool and it's been used for 10 years. If you don't want to do that, and you've actually, at some point you have to say, there's a limit as to how much entropy I can actually find by just looking at the computer. At some point you actually have to add an entropy source, a physical hardware entropy source. So if you're lucky enough to use an HSM, or you're lucky enough to have smart cards available, or PCI cards, then these things have hardware random number generators built in. They have hardware entropy sources. And again, there's lots of ways you can make hardware entropy sources. You can make unstable circuits. You can use semiconductor junctions that are reverse biased. You can use, even resistors generate electrical noise that you can amplify and try and sample and capture into entropy. Lots of different ways of doing it, lots of different devices. Trouble is, not many of your applications have the luxury of playing with a dedicated bolt-on hardware like an HSM. A tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the keys in your enterprise will benefit from HSMs. All the rest, are just sitting there on software. There are embedded tools. Intel added a function to some of their CPUs called RDRAND, which builds a physical entropy source into the CPU. The trouble with these hardware sources, sometimes they're expensive. It's another piece of hardware to manage in some cases, and it falls down the same argument, which is when we live in an abstracted world, we don't want to care very much about the hardware. People these days don't want to think about hardware. We just want to assume the hardware's sort of there and it's sort of available and it's ready for us. So tying our entropy sources back to the hardware, through the hypervisor and through whatever containerization there, and assume that our applications can see right down into these chips, can sometimes be a stretch. And not something you can easily track and prove after the fact from a compliance point of view. So the third area is an evolving area. It's pretty new. So this is the notion of delivering entropy over a network as a service, either from a local source or non-local source. There have been random number services forever. The most famous is random.org. Think of this as really like NTP, Network Time Protocol. And so in the same way that you can't trust a server to know the time of day, and it doesn't make sense to build an atomic clock into every machine. You therefore have an atomic clock in the corner of your data center or up in the cloud somewhere that synchronizes everything in your data center. So this rather than building a dedicated piece of hardware into every server, you put a single piece of hardware in your data center or as a service, and you deliver entropy over the network using a secure connection. In the spirit of disclosure, we do that. And this is my service, getting at random, so check it out. The good news is, I told you there's no standard there's no easy way of testing for randomness and entropy. So NIST have actually finally bitten the bullet. I missed the guy from NIST speaking on it. He may have talked about this already. So NIST have bitten the bullet and spent the last 5 years developing a standard to actually validate entropy sources and actually go test entropy sources and actually come up with something called an entropy score. as a percentage. So you could say, hey, this dodgy resistor or this metastable circuit or whatever it might be, is a 76% entropic source or a 92% entropic source. So it's not out yet. It was supposed to have been out last summer. Then it was going to be out this summer. So this thing could show up at any time.
At random.
Possibly. Well, it's the government, right? So it could show up any time.
It's using the publication date.
You can read it. I mean, it's up there. So it's called SP890B. It's at its second draft, and actually NIST have already posted the software tools to go actually run the tests to come up with an entropy score. So it's a pretty big deal, and apparently this is going to be folded into FIPS 140, and it'll become part of FIPS 140 product certifications at some point. Things like HSMs and smart cards and software crypto toolkits and all the rest of it are FIPS 140 certified, most of them anyway. All right, that's all I was going to say on entropy. So third one, quantum computers. Anybody got a quantum computer? Excellent.
NSA's got it.
Yeah, you probably sell them. If you got one, again, you shouldn't be sitting here. You should be out there cracking the internet. So quantum computers are interesting, not because they go fast, although they do go fast. They're interesting because of this chap, Peter Shaw, which, in addition to being a very snappy dresser, this is his own line of shirts, I believe. You can buy them online. So Peter Shaw invented or came up with, postulated something called Shaw's algorithm. And Shaw's algorithm is one of the most scary things that exists because Shaw's algorithm allows you to calculate a private key from a public key. So if you've got an SSL certificate, you can go calculate. You don't have to guess or brute force. You just simply go calculate the private key. So if you could do Shaw's algorithm in your head, you could literally break the internet. You could go figure out what Amazon's private key is and put up a website that looked and could be proven to be Amazon. And you could break, Bitcoin, and you could break sort of everything. The good news is classical computers can't run Shaw's algorithm. Can't do it. Bad news is quantum computers can. So that's why everybody is concerned about the arrival of quantum computers, because it means that all asymmetric crypto is basically overturned with the arrival of these things. Pretty scary. So that comes down to when are they going to show up, and that comes down to whether you're a glass half empty, glass half full type of person. I'm English, so obviously I'm a glass half empty sort of person, and you're probably mostly American, so you're glass half full type of people. So I'll do with you first. So if you think it takes this long to build a quantum computer that's strong enough to crack an asymmetric key, and you think in the meantime we can define a quantum safe system and build quantum safe products and get them into your data centers, and we can do that before the computer shows up, then we're all good, right? That's just good. We're just thinking ahead and building our systems, everything's fine. But if we can't, then that brings us into a situation where our existing crypto systems become vulnerable before we can figure out how to fix them. And our track record of doing this is not very good. Last time we tried to do a crypto algorithm, AES for example, it took 10 years to validate this thing. And it took at least another 10 years then to go build the products and get them into circulation and to get rid of the old stuff. There's still, I won't even dare ask for a show of hands of who thinks they might still have deprecated algorithms in their data centers now. SHA-1 and MD5 and all that good stuff. Things that were are broken during conference sessions. Never mind by the Russians. And you would think getting an algorithm that you could prove to be quantum safe is probably a harder job than proving the security of AES. Firstly, because you're trying to tackle a harder problem, and secondly, because you've got nothing to test it against. So you're talking about theoretical tests rather than practical tests. So it comes down to which side of the fence you live on. So opinions differ widely. Everybody, I think, generally thought this was all 30 or 40 or 50 years in the future. This is not something that we would have to deal with. This would be something our kids would have to deal with, but not us. And then NSA came out 18 months or so ago now and said, no, this really is something you should worry about. And they started talking about like an 8-year planning horizon. They even went as far as to say, if you had not already migrated to Suite B, which is the latest government-approved elliptic curve algorithms, don't bother because they're going to be superseded, and you should wait and go and implement what are going to be proven to be quantum safe algorithms. And NIST are currently running they don't want to call it a competition, but a project right now for people to solicit candidate quantum safe algorithms, and that candidate closes in the fall in a couple of months, I think in November, and then the process of actually formally proving these things are safe will start. Folks from Google have come out and said, no, it really is a long way away, which is interesting because Google at the same time have promoted their own quantum safe algorithm and have already built it into versions of Chrome. So some of you may even have some of the Chrome versions that use this thing called New Hope, which is a Google post-quantum or quantum safe algorithm. So I mean, and credit to Google for putting something out there and trying it and making it available to go and try and break. Yes, sir.
The crypto problem, however, is different from the security problem. From a security perspective, we're going to be able to continue to use the same kinds of asymmetric key mechanisms that we use today, probably for decades after quantum computers become available, because they're going to be very, very expensive and rare for
Right.
a long time.
That's right.
Therefore, they will be used by people who are in the wholesale business of cracking keys, people like NSA and GCHQ.
Mm-hmm.
But that will not be relevant for most of our uses of crypto. For example, TLS, where the life of a key is equal to the length of a session, and generally relatively short, measured in minutes. Now, we will still have a problem with forward security.
Right.
But for most of our applications, that's not really a big thing. My favorite example is Reuters, where Reuters sells at a huge premium data which it plans to give away in 15 minutes. So that the value of the data is dropping very, very rapidly with time. And that's true for most of our applications.
Well, it depends on the data, yeah, but certainly in some cases.
If you go back to the slide for sure.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that device has to live in liquid helium, right?
It does, yeah. That's right. This thing lives at
Liquid helium refrigerators, I think.
This thing lives at millikelvin, thousandths of a degree Kelvin.
$250,000, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, these things are not cheap. Yeah, and you're right. The day that one person or one agency has one of these things to the day that we all have one, that potentially is a long period of time, but we'll see. I think we're seeing product life cycles get shorter though over time.
I start with the assumption that the 5 or 6 big nation states in this field, Iran, Israel, France,
England.
Germany, England, and the U.S. can read any message they want to anyway.
Well, I don't know.
Every message that they want to, but they can read any message that they want.
I think they may have tried over the years, whether they succeeded or not. I know, and certainly some of those countries are recording everything today because they believe at some point in the future they will be able to break them.
But in the face of that, I can still do most applications that I have to worry about securely.
Okay. Depends on who you're scared of. Depends on what your data is and who you think might want to steal it.
I say most applications that I've got to worry about.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it only takes some. How long is it till one's in Amazon and you can rent it?
Applications that can't be done that way. They're just a vanishingly small number of them.
Sure. But if I was Amazon or I was Microsoft, I'd want one of these things, and if I had one of these things, I'd rent it out.
As a service.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm in the cloud business, everything's getting commoditized, and I'm charging 2 cents an hour for this particular instance. If I could charge $1,000 an hour to go use my quantum thing,
Actually,
that's pretty cool.
Good point, because considering the size of some Bitcoin mining operations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean obviously
They have
Bitcoin is based on
resources
is all asymmetric. Yeah,
potentially
absolutely.
do this, yes.
So symmetric crypto is safe, well, relatively safe. There's something else called Grover's algorithm, which means you can reduces the exponent by 2. So as long as you double your keys for AES, and AES is safe. So not all crypto is broken. So the issue really comes down to asymmetric crypto, and the primary role for asymmetric crypto is sharing keys. So the issue is not so much encrypting the data, it's how do you get the keys there in the first place, and that's what today asymmetric crypto is used for. So, I mean, there's a chap called Michael Moscow who's at the University of Waterloo, is sort of one of the more prominent voices in this space. So I think last year he was forecasting that there'll be a quantum computer that can break 2048-bit asymmetric keys. There's a 1 in 7 chance of that happening by 2026, and a 1 in 2 chance of that happening by 2032. Which sounded a long way away until you do the math, and it's sort of, okay, that's not that far away, particularly if you're building, if you're building data centers now, or you're building IoT systems now, if you're thinking about driverless vehicles, chances are those vehicles are still going to be on the road in 2032, if you're only thinking about building them now. So what's interesting is how you solve this problem, and I put this out for you to sort of watch this space, because I think there's essentially a race on. So the physicists think you can basically only fight fire with fire, and the only way you can defend against quantum attack is by using quantum mechanics, actually using the physics of photons to move keys around. You've probably heard of entanglement, but there are less sophisticated approaches than entanglement, specifically quantum key distribution, where you can literally fire single photons down fiber, or you can even fire single photons through space from satellite to ground to establish key pairs that are provably secure with a mathematical proof. And there aren't many security tools that have a mathematical proof, but it does.
This is an easier problem, is it not?
Easier.
Quantum key distribution is an easier problem than quantum computing.
Oh yeah, much easier. Yes, because you're not trying to make a quantum computer, you're just trying to use quantum mechanics to share a key. Oh, this exists. You can buy products that do this. And there have been demonstrations. I mean, in fact, the Chinese just demonstrated doing quantum key distribution from satellite to Earth. And there is a fiber QKD link being built between Shanghai and Beijing. So yeah, this stuff exists. It's got horrendous deployment challenges. It's not cheap and it's a complete pain, but it exists. Now the math guys think you don't need all that weird physics stuff. You don't need all that photonic optics. You can just do this by coming up with a new algorithm. We've done it before, we can do it again. If we know how quantum computers can work, then we can invent some math that is defensible. And there are 6 or 7 there's at least 4 different types of algorithms that are quantum safe or expected to be quantum safe. And these are the algorithms that NIST are now going to start to approve and validate. So the distinction in language, this is called quantum crypto, it's using the quantum mechanical effects to establish a cryptographic mechanism. This is called post-quantum crypto or quantum safe algorithms. So it's the math guys versus the physicists. So a lot of people have got their money on the math guys, not because they don't like physicists, but just because if these guys win, then it's a software upgrade. If these guys can't do the job and we have to go to this, then we're digging up the ground and replacing much of our telecom network. So that's not much fun. So when you see discussions about the post-quantum world and how we're going to address this cryptopocalypse, always think about are we talking about algorithms here? Is this math? Or are we talking about physics and photons and quantum mechanics to deal with keys? All right, I'm going to wrap up because I think I'm pretty much out of time. So I think crypto's been sort of on these sort of niche, slightly weird technologies that most people sort of try to sort of avoid for a long time. It's sort of math, it's complicated, don't touch it. But I think those sort of days are gone. I think any sense that the macro trends that we see every day, cloud, IoT, Bitcoin, are just not possible without cryptography. So it's something that everybody needs to know. They don't necessarily need to know the math and how it all works, but they certainly need to know about the practicality of deploying this stuff and what it means. what's weird about crypto is this dependence on secrecy and secrets. And that gives it a sort of an interesting relationship with hardware. You know, everything else we try and do in computer science tries to get us away from the hardware, you know, and all the trends have taken us in that direction. But this is one of those weird little things, one of those strange little subjects where there is an affinity to the hardware. Locking down keys, generating entropy, you know, is interesting. And as you think about moving out to the cloud or moving into containers or running things on very skinny IoT things, that's something to bear in mind. So the planning issues, obviously, are anti-tamper. You know, chances are not many keys in your enterprise can justify the cost of being physically tamper protected. For all the rest, they have at least got to be random, because if they're not random, they can be guessed. When you start thinking about random number generators, you're only one step away from backdoors and that whole privacy debate. And then, you know, do your own research and believe who you want to believe in terms of when the quantum threat shows up. But keep in mind this balance. You know, we don't get to build quantum systems quickly, and we certainly don't get to deploy them very quickly. So there's even though this might seem a 15-year problem, you know, we don't do very many things these days in 15 years, even though we think we probably can. So in the spirit of disclosure, I will, you know, plug my stuff. So we have quantum mechanical sources. We make quantum entropy. We deliver quantum entropy over the network. We have a service. You can pay my service. Getnetrandom.com, so we stream entropy to the operating system. So you don't have to add any hardware, it goes straight into Linux. We basically make dev random always run, and we make dev urandom as good as dev random. And we do the same for Windows. We also have a bunch of technology in terms of QKD, so we're on the physics side of that argument. And as I think I said, our background is Los Alamos National Lab, so the US quantum crypto effort was primarily at Los Alamos Labs, so we're plugged into that stuff. That's my email address if anybody wants to send me an email. And happy to chat about this stuff later. Thank you. Now you're done. No more slides.
Good question.
Yeah.
You know, would you say, if you can say, you know, that some of these cloud providers, you know, people like who reside in this building and others use products like yours? Are they customers?
I wish. So we're brand new. We only launched this stuff, you know, a few months ago. But
Do you think you brought out as the IoT devices being a problem because everybody needs more crypto and so on, but at the same time this thing is loaded with environmental sensors.
yes, it is.
So do you think that could actually become a solution for this problem?
Maybe. So I'll answer your question first. So if you go to Amazon, Amazon have, I don't know, 15 or so different Linux distributions you can pull down, you can choose. And you can ask Linux how much entropy it thinks it's got. And I think we did some tests, and I think about 2/3 of them basically had zero entropy. And we worked with the University of Wisconsin to instrument a copy of Linux to actually grab the entropy coming off, or the entropy going into this entropy pool from disk interrupts and network traffic and all the rest of it, and put it through the NIST entropy test suite to see how entropic it was. And it was, I think it was about 11% entropy, which is very low. You'd want to be in the 90%. So VMs is a problem. And there have been research papers talking about, you know, this issue of replicating VMs and synchronizing our PRNGs and reseeding times. I think there's a general awareness of what's sort of called the 5-minute rule, which is don't generate keys on Linux until it's been running for 5 minutes, until it's gathered some entropy, which of course is not what happens. You know, oftentimes when you boot this stuff up, the very first thing it does is go away and generate all of its system keys. It goes and generates its SSH keys. One of the very first things Linux does is generate SSH keys, which is...
Shamir observes that people do not break crypto, they bypass it.
But can't you just refresh? You know, okay, I'm
Yeah.
going to run a script that, you know, after 5 minutes I'm going to go pick a new entropy value.
Right. So some of these problems can be solved. You know, I call it the cup of tea problem. You know, if you just go make a cup of tea, come back and make your keys, then you're in a much better position than you were. Absolutely. So your question about phones, yes, absolutely. I mean, phones are full of sensors. You're right. Absolutely. You know, you've got dozens of sensors in that thing. So in principle, you've got an almost infinite amount of access to entropy in a phone.
So maybe move the crypto generation from the server side actually to the client side.
Yeah, I mean that's the PKI model, right? I mean most certificates are generated on the user device, not at the certificate authority. The question is, to what degree does the operating system and whatever containerization technology and then whatever application technology takes advantage of those sensors? So just because the sensors are there doesn't mean to say they're being used, and it's actually impossible to find out. We've not found an easy way of determining where any particular copy of Linux or Android has actually got its entropy from. So retrospectively, trying to say, you know, 60% of it came from radio antenna, you know, 20% of it came from GPS chips. If you could figure that out, then you'd be in decent shape. But unfortunately, you can't, and you can't test the numbers either. So in principle, it's great, but in practice, you don't know.
I'm thinking if you were bringing also out that the developer would be choosing the true random because it's just faster. But if you actually would feed all those sources into the dev random source, then the developer might make a different decision at that point.
Right, but that comes down to tweaking the operating system, you know. But that hasn't really happened. Linux, I think, only has 3 entropy sources. I don't know how many Android's got. Windows does a better job. You know, we're in a Microsoft building. I think Windows uses 12 or 13 different entropy sources, or at least tries to. Linux not so much. So yeah, in principle, the operating system could, but in practice, it doesn't really. Yes.
So, I mean, a little bit of history, I guess. I only came here a little bit into your talk. I was at another talk, decided to come to this one instead.
Shocking.
In the 1970s, they were looking for a trapdoor function, something that's hard to calculate one way, but easy to calculate the other way.
Yeah.
And the GCHQ ended up, someone found that the GCHQ ended up having confidentiality rights to the RSA encryption, and then the RSA trio independently found that function. But now we have like 8 potential trapdoor functions that, for post-quantum cryptography, what are your thoughts on how we used to only have one, and it took decades for us to all of a sudden find 8 more? Like, we just kind of found them all, but before we independently found only this one function. What are your thoughts on?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. Is your point that this stuff gets a lot harder to test?
Not necessarily. It's 2 different groups of people found through the hardness of the factorization of a product of 2 large primes
Right.
in the 70s.
That's right.
Independently.
That's right.
Accidentally finding the same thing.
That's right.
And then we used that for decades.
That's right.
Now we have like 8 possible solutions that fit that same standard, that whole trapdoor function.
That's right.
Thing. What's your opinions on just all of a sudden having one trapdoor function and now we have a lot? Do you think that's good, bad, potentially sketchy, maybe less likely to be accurate?
Yeah. Well, I'm not. I mean, I was. There was a. I was actually at a post-quantum crypto conference, believe it or not, a few weeks ago, and I think there are currently about 4 primary methods of establishing that one-way function. The most popular seems to be lattice, using lattice networks, which is what the Google preferred, this New Hope algorithm uses. So this is the problem, trying to find some reverse paths with some 3D space. But each of the 4 different methods has its own trapdoor method. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge that NIST have got. You know, it's. At the end of the day, proving these algorithms is essentially validating that claim of being an irreversible function. And they're all 4 are different, completely different mathematically. And the math guys still don't seem to have a crystal clear answer as to exactly how do they prove these things are not reversible.
It's similar to some conferences I've heard mathematicians talk about how, as I said, factoring the product of two large primes we think is hard because we haven't seen it be easy yet.
Right.
But theoretically it could be super easy. We just haven't found the easy way yet.
It's what's
Right.
called an incomplete problem. You can't prove
That's right.
that it is difficult.
That's right. And then
You
of
just
course,
know that so far it has been difficult.
And of course
it's been difficult for 2,000 years with factoring. The Greeks.
and then of course you have the double problem is when you come up with a quantum safe trapdoor, I would say backdoor, trapdoor, a quantum irreversible function. Of course, it still needs to be classically irreversible with existing computers as well. So you've almost got double the problem. So you're not just trying to solve the quantum problem. You're also trying to invent a next generation classical classical algorithm as well.
And at least you only have to generally solve for Shor's algorithm, which just means don't do things that can be broken with discrete log problems or just factoring numbers. If it's not based on factoring, theoretically it should work. Good luck finding those things.
Exactly. So this is why things like isogenies and lattice networks take a completely different perspective, work on a fundamentally different approach.
There was a lattice computer session RSA this year.
Yep. Yeah, it was surprising how little post-quantum sessions there were at RSA, given that it historically is a crypto show.
Well, there are other crypto topics.
Encryption is a sexy thing now.
Well, mobile's driving that, of course.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I'm gonna go.
we should probably convene to the wrap-up session.
Yeah.
We should probably, who knows, we might be winners sitting in this room.
But you never know.
Eh?
Never know.
Eh?